Hey everyone, welcome back to the Irretrievable Breakdown podcast where we discuss all things divorce. I'm Matt Dolan with Dolan Divorce Lawyers in Connecticut, and I am joined by my co-host and managing partner of our firm, Nicole Bikakis. And today we are going to talk about whether or not you should stay in the house or move out while your divorce is pending. You can watch our show on YouTube, or you can catch us on the go on either Apple Podcasts or Spotify. If you'd like to listen to this show on a weekly basis, you can subscribe to the show. So, Nicole, what are your thoughts as to whether or not somebody should or should not move out of their house while their divorce is pending?
So it's a loaded question. Obviously, people who are going through a divorce are up against a home environment that's really stressful and could be extremely difficult for someone to continue living in that situation during the divorce. So this is a loaded question. There's a lot to consider when you're deciding whether, now that you're in your divorce, whether you should stay in the house until the divorce is final or move out prior to the divorce finalizing.
So let's just touch on a few things to dispel some concerns and kind of things that people think in general. So first of all, if you are filing and you're planning on serving your spouse at their house, it's totally fine to leave the house for like a couple days just to give them a little space and let things settle down. That's not the same as moving out. I think in almost all scenarios, it's fine to just leave for a few days, knowing that you're planning to come back. So would you agree with that? Do you think there's anything to worry about if you're leaving temporarily?
No, not at all. And in fact, that could probably give some much needed space for everyone to kind of calm down when that first receipt of the divorce papers occurs. And I think it's important for people to understand that they do not have to leave the house too. I think some people think that one person needs to leave the house during the divorce, and both spouses are allowed and have a right to stay in the home while the divorce is pending.
Unless there's a court order to the contrary. And we'll get into that. There are scenarios where somebody is legally required to leave the house. So on that note, if you think your spouse is required to leave the house just because you filed for divorce or they filed for divorce, that is not the case. Don't go changing the locks to your house. That's a crime. It's called criminal lockout, and that could get you into trouble. So don't just change the locks unless there's a court order authorizing you to do so, or you've received legal advice telling you that it's okay to change the locks.
And also don't make it really miserable for the other person to live there during the divorce in an effort to try and force them out of the house, because that will backfire and not look good.
Right.
To the court.
Right. Exactly. Now, another concern people have is they think that if they leave the house, they're giving up all rights to the house. And that is not the case. There's equity in the house. If there's a $500,000 house with a $250,000 loan on it, there's $250,000 of equity in the house. And by leaving the house while the divorce is pending, that does not jeopardize your claim to that equity in the house. All assets that are part of the marital estate can be divided, and it doesn't matter that you moved out of the house. You still have a claim to that equity. So that's something that people do not have to worry about.
No, that's correct. So it's your claim to the house can be twofold. It's the financial interest in the house and your share of the home equity. But the other part of it is if you want to keep the house after the divorce, that's a separate claim to consider, and really something important. If you are considering leaving the house during the divorce, but you ultimately want to stay in the house, then strategically, you probably should not leave the house.
Right. Because ultimately, if both parties want to keep the house after the divorce is finalized, taking equity out of it, because if, somebody can buy the other out of the house if they're keeping the house. But if you want the physical house, you're really giving up a lot of leverage by moving out of the house, because judges are kind of more likely to maintain the status quo. So if you move out and your spouse is still in the house, a judge is more likely to allow the person who is still in the house to keep the house in order to kind of keep things consistent. And that's especially true if there are children involved. Judges are very concerned with the consistency for children, and they're going to be reluctant to have one parent move out of the house and the other parent move into the house after the divorce is finalized. So, there's a number of things to consider, but one factor is that if you want to be keeping the physical house after the divorce, you probably should not move out, all other things equal.
Well, and also the reality is, for a contested divorce, that divorce is going to take a while to resolve. And so it could be months, a year, and your divorce can still be going on. And so if you've moved out a year ago from the marital home, that just really helps shape a narrative that favors the person who stayed in the home if there's competing claims to wanting to keep the house and buy the other person out.
Right. So let's talk about financial obligations towards a house while the divorce is pending if somebody decides to move out. What do those obligations look like, Nicole?
So those obligations remain the same during the pendency of the divorce. When you file for divorce, your obligation to continue contributing towards the marital expenses remains the same. And when you file for divorce, there are automatic orders that go into place that essentially prohibit you from stopping any insurances, pending insurances. And typically we construe those automatic orders broadly to also include, you can't stop paying the utilities on the house, right? You can't all of a sudden cut off electrical or internet or heat to the house. All those expenses need to be maintained. And so if you are considering leaving the house, you need to be able to maintain two households at the same time, right?
Right. You and your spouse, not just you. You as a
Correct.
family need to be able to maintain both households. It's obviously becoming a lot more expensive if you go from one household to two. So you shouldn't be under the impression that, I decide to move out, therefore I have no financial obligation towards the home. That is not the case generally. Now,
Well,
if
yeah.
the person who's still in the home is the primary wage earner, or they have plenty of money to pay all the expenses towards the house, it's possible that you will have no financial obligation to the house while the divorce is ongoing. But it's also possible that if you move out, you will then have to keep contributing towards the house that you moved out from. So it's generally not advisable to move out unless you have a financial plan in place as to how the bills are going to be paid for both households.
Well,
Because you don't want to be sticking yourself with a new lease only to realize that later a judge is ordering you to pay, half the mortgage or all of the mortgage or a certain portion of the utilities on your marital home, and then you realize you don't have enough money to pay for your new lease. That's not a situation you want to be in.
right. A court's going to look at if you voluntarily moved out of the house, and then also look at what has the status quo been in terms of expenses. So if you are the individual who primarily pays most of the household expenses and you voluntarily move out, you are going to continue that obligation to pay those expenses while also having to now pay the expenses for your new residence. If you are the individual that typically has not paid expenses on the house, and then you voluntarily move out, creating a whole new set of expenses while the divorce is pending, you need to be careful, because a judge might look at that and say that you shouldn't have made that decision to move out before you could afford it.
Right.
So
And then you'll be in a position where you can't make your rent payments.
that's right.
And you cannot, just to be clear, you cannot go out and buy a house while the divorce is pending. The automatic orders prohibit you from buying any real estate. So unless the other side agrees or a court authorizes you to purchase real estate, you should not do this. We're talking about going and renting a new place.
And also, this should be obvious. You can't list the home for sale once you file for divorce before the divorce is resolved, unless, again, it's by agreement.
Right. So let's talk about, away from the finances and more about custody. So there are, of course, also custody implications on moving out of the house. So generally speaking, your kids are probably going to, remain in the house if you decide to move out, or I suppose it's possible that they could come with you. But, it becomes confusing and it becomes a gray area where if you move out and there are no court orders in place as to what the parenting schedule is. So you're really leaving yourself open to a lot of kind of chaos, as far as parenting schedule if you move out with no plan in place. And you also leave yourself open to, having less of a claim to custody if you move out and the kids stay in the marital home. If you're seeking, either a shared parenting plan, which is close to 50-50, or you want primary physical custody with you probably should not move out of the house until there is a set parenting plan in place, which is in writing and is a court order. Because again, if you move out without that parenting plan in place, you're giving up some leverage as far as parenting time.
I think with all of this, though, safety does change the analysis. And so if you are thinking about whether you should or should not move out of the house, that's if there are circumstances or conditions when your safety is at risk or the safety of your children's at risk, that does change the analysis. And you need to talk to your lawyer about the best way to protect yourself in those situations, whether that's by filing a restraining order or filing a motion for exclusive use and possession. Or in this case, if it really makes sense to move out again, if there are concerns about whether it's domestic violence or other type of safety concerns, sometimes moving out is the best option, and it's the best way and the surest way to protect yourself.
Right, for sure. Like safety is obviously number one, and you need to make sure you are not putting yourself or your children in a dangerous situation. So that may mean you just have to move out of the house if you realize that, getting a restraining order is not a viable option. Or, again, you can file a restraining order and have your spouse removed from the house. But I would be hesitant to file the restraining order unless you speak with a lawyer and they're confident that it will be granted, because you don't want to be in a situation where you file a restraining order and then it's denied, because that can just further embolden your spouse to behave poorly.
And to be clear, safety is very different from discomfort. I mean, obviously, during a divorce, things in the household are going to be tense and are going to be unpleasant. But if there aren't safety concerns as part of that, sometimes it's best to kind of just get through that situation and endure sort of the unpleasantness, so that you can maintain your claims to custody and ensure that the finances are all taken care of prior to, either party moving out at the end of the case when your divorce has been issued.
Right. So it may make sense to endure that discomfort, or it may not. You may decide that you don't want to endure that discomfort, and you really, it's just too emotionally taxing for you, or maybe you feel that this, sort of unhealthy, arrangement that's really not, it's not on the level of a restraining order, but you feel it's an unhealthy arrangement that's negatively impacting your children, for example. You may put all of these leverage things aside of, your claim to keeping the house or, having the leg up on custody. You may decide that it's just not worth it to you to put your kids in a situation where they are in an unhealthy environment, or you yourself just can't deal with it. So, it's okay to move out of the house and sort of give up these leverage points. if that, if that's something you decide to do, that you don't want to go through it yourself and you don't want to put your kids through it. So
Either way, I think you need to, if this isn't like a pure safety concern and you're making the decision that it's worth moving out of the house for your sanity and your emotional well-being and the well-being of your children to be separated and not have everyone live under the same roof with the situation being so tense, you should at least try and have a conversation with your spouse before you move out, because that will make things, if you guys can come to certain agreements, it'll just make everything a lot easier than moving out without having that conversation. And now all of a sudden, there will likely be all these motions filed to deal with the situation of not having any agreement on who's paying what for the house, or not having an agreement on a temporary parenting plan for the children. So again, having that conversation prior to moving out, if you really feel like you can't endure the environment at home, is still important to do.
right. And, the home environment being a uncomfortable situation, that can also be a reason to stay in the house. If you have a spouse who's sort of dragging out the divorce and, refusing to settle, on reasonable terms, you may want to create a little bit of discomfort in the home. Certainly don't be like behave very poorly, but if you move out of the house and they're just able to live in the house and be comfortable, and maybe you're paying the bills, they probably don't have a huge incentive to resolve your case and settle it. So creating that little bit of discomfort so that they're not feeling like, they can just be in the house forever and have you pay the bills, that can be a good thing to help move your case towards a resolution. Because, the longer your case goes on, the more you're going to spend in legal fees, and the more you're just going through the emotionally difficult situation of having a divorce go on for months or, God forbid, years. So that discomfort can be a reason to move out, but it can also be a reason to stay, to try to get everybody to act in good faith to resolve the divorce case.
I mean, the reality is, if you're having an unpleasant time living in the house during the divorce, so is your spouse. So again, having the incentives in place for you guys to resolve the divorce so you can both go your separate ways and start fresh in your own separate households, that is a strategic point to consider.
Right, right. And then if you do move out of the house, location matters, particularly when it comes to custody. So if you have children and you move to a different town, for example, and that would require, the kids to change school districts, like, good luck getting primary physical custody in your new school district, because, judges are going to be reluctant to have kids change school districts, particularly if they're older. So you really want to be thinking about location as well. And generally speaking, the closer the two parents can be to one another, the better, and the better co-parenting relationship you're going to have, and, the smoother the custody negotiations are going to go.
If you're in the middle of your divorce and you have an attorney or there is a guardian ad litem in place for the children, have conversations with both of these people before you decide you're moving out, and make a plan as to where you're going to move out. Again, that aligns with what your goals are for the divorce.
Mm-hmm. Right. And so we talked a little bit about filing a restraining order, and, that is for higher levels of physical safety and things like that. That is when a restraining order is appropriate. But you can also file a motion for exclusive use of the house. That's either to have the other spouse removed from the house if they are still living there, and getting a family court order for them to go live somewhere else. And that's without the need for a restraining order. Or maybe they have moved out and they're kind of coming and going as they please, and it's uncomfortable for you, because you never know when they're going to show up. In that situation, a motion for exclusive use, is probably likely to be granted. But if the two of you are still living under the same roof and you file the motion for exclusive use, it's a pretty high burden to get somebody removed from the house. Obviously with a restraining order, if there's threatening or physical safety issues, you can get them out. It's very possible to get them out. But short of that, judges are quite reluctant to remove somebody from the house via motion for exclusive use. But it is possible to have the family court do that. So, if you're working with an attorney, you can discuss with them sort of what's going on in your family dynamic and whether or not they think that a motion for exclusive use is appropriate in your situation.
And the other thing to consider too, if you're thinking of leaving the house, is also just your access to whether it's documents or belongings that are in the house, because you can move and take some of your personal belongings, but you shouldn't be removing things that are marital property from the house during the divorce.
Right. But if there's like financial documents you want to have access to, you can take a picture with your phone or make copies. But take that into consideration and know that there's very much a possibility that you will not be coming back to that house until a judge orders you to, essentially, or authorizes you to get your stuff from the home. So those are sort of the basics on what you need to think about when you're considering whether or not you want to move out of the house while your divorce is pending. Nicole, do you have any last words of wisdom for people before we part ways here?
Just that if you are considering moving out of the house, you should consider whether you're doing it for your safety or your emotional well-being. And if that's, in that case, are you willing to potentially create like a new status quo that might be easy for a judge to order enforced after the divorce is finalized, and whether that is the other person keeping the home or the children primarily living in the marital home with the other parent. So really consider that move carefully and talk to your lawyer before making any decisions.
That is good advice, Nicole. So that's going to do it for this week's episode of the Irretrievable Breakdown podcast. You can listen to us on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, or Spotify. And as usual, if you have any additional questions, you can contact our office. Or if you are looking for representation in a divorce or family law case here in Connecticut, we would invite you to contact our office as well. Take care, everybody.